America. This is Kiara Ashanti, and this is the Business Intercept, where we bring interesting business stories or economic stories to you. And today we're going to talk about something that you might not think is a business or economic story, but it certainly is. And this is what's happening across the country weather-wise. It is cold, real cold in most of the country, particularly in Texas. Now, I myself am here in Orlando, Florida, where it's been, Florida weather. So people really hate me right now, and I really feel sorry for my friends that are in Texas and family that's in Oklahoma and New Jersey and New York and all those places. But I want to talk about Texas because this is actually both a business, economic, and political story. As you well know, the power grid in Texas, or large parts of Texas, has kind of stopped working. People can't get heat to their homes. They can't get water because either the pipes are frozen, the water's frozen, or all of the systems that you would use to move the water into your sinks and bathtubs and showers aren't working. So it's a really big mess. But what's happening in terms of the specifics is what we're going to talk about, because I've heard a lot of commentary, and if you've been watching the news, you probably have as well, about the cause of this situation. Tucker Carlson has talked about the windmills in Texas. AOC has talked about actually if they had more green energy, this would have not happened. You've also had people who are more on the Democratic liberal side talking about this shows a failure of the oil and gas sector. And they're all wrong. Tucker's more right than everybody else, but it's the details, right? The devil is always in the details. And so what we're going to talk about is what the details are as to why this situation happened, number one, and then talk about the economic decisions that need to be made going forward and how it will affect everybody in that particular state. Okay, so we're going to start off with what this isn't. Yes, this is an extreme event in terms of the temperatures. I've got a little graphic here. No, not that one. Let's see, where is the graphic that I want to show you? There we go. So this is kind of what parts of Texas looks like right now, right? They're going to get more snow. There's going to be more ice. It's so cold that the new snow is going to turn the ice, and it's just a big mess. Okay, so the power grid failed to a certain degree. You're having rolling blackouts in Texas. Some people are going to say this is further proof of extreme weather brought on by climate change and global warming. That is not true. Okay? What you have to understand is, in order for any event, this situation like this in Texas, hurricanes in Florida, extreme heat in other areas of the country, what you always have to ask is this unprecedented? Unprecedented means it's never happened before. Or if they say it's happening more often, then you have to see instances in the last 2 to 3 years of it being extremely higher in terms of the amount than it has been in the past. So, what's happening in Texas is the first time it's happened in 120 some odd years. Now, what that sentence means is Texas has seen this weather happen before. That it happened before, and it happened before we had a whole bunch of cars and nuclear power and electrical systems and coal plants, before we had all of that infrastructure in place, this weather pattern happened before in Texas. That means two things. It's not unprecedented, and it's not the result of extreme weather. It's not. Okay, because when it's happened before and all the things that you say cause global warming and climate change weren't around, then obviously this is something that doesn't need those things in order to occur. So whoever's saying that this is because of that, look them in the face, look them in the eye, and say, no, it's not. I do this every year whenever we have a large hurricane down here in Florida. When they say, oh, it's unprecedented. Hurricanes are happening more often in Florida. And then you look at the number of hurricanes that have happened, and it's about the same average as it's in the past. You look at how many Category 4 and Category 5 hurricanes we have in this year or last year or the year before, and you see that they're not any more than what we had in the 70s or 80s or 60s. Which by definition means we're not having more extreme weather. Okay, so what exactly happened in Texas in details? So let's go through how the electrical grid, in terms of power consumption and usage, is generated in Texas. It's generated in three different ways. Now, the most obvious way is oil and gas. Texas is still a big oil state. They're a big natural gas state. They've got a lot of infrastructure for that. I would call it legacy infrastructure, meaning infrastructure that's been in place for decades. Okay, that's the important term here, legacy. So you've got that. You also have nuclear power plants. So Texas has nuclear power plants, and they provide some electrical grid power for the systems in Texas. That, again, is a legacy power system. Remember that word, legacy. Then you've got the windmills. So in Houston and in other parts of Texas, partly because there were actually some mayors in Texas that jumped on the green wagon in terms of trying to set up systems that would be generated through wind power and solar, and as well as subsidies. So there are subsidies that make doing this very attractive in terms of lowering the costs, providing what I call artificial profits for the companies that build these systems, because of course the money's not coming from public demand, the money's not coming from consumers, the money's coming from the government in real checks. And when I say subsidies, there's a difference between getting a tax break, which doesn't mean that, if you get a tax break of $25,000, what that means, if you're a company, is you get to take $25,000 off of your income. It's not the government sending you a $25,000 check, but there are subsidies in which the government will pay you to get solar, pay localities and states to install windmills and solar panels, and they essentially will send money to the state to do that. So they're paying the state to add this infrastructure that they ordinarily might not add into the state power grid. Okay, so that's the framework. Okay, so what happened, as you probably heard, is the windmills iced over. It got so cold with a combination of the condensation that naturally occurs on the windmills themselves, cold air and snow, they froze, wouldn't work. During cold winter months, the way the Texas grid is set up, windmills account for about 25% of the power generation. Okay, so you've got nuclear and gas on one side, and then on the other side you've got the windmills, and they account for 25% of it. Okay, so the way that they have this situated is because the windmills are accounting for upwards of 25%, the other systems are calibrated to provide the rest. And when I say calibrated, that means the system is now set up to work best, optimally, when all three systems are working. Okay? So even though technically you could have more power generated by oil and gas and nuclear, the way they've got it set up, they're not doing that. Now, if a system fails or needs to be repaired or whatever the case may be, obviously built into the system is the ability for those other systems to scale up and make up the difference. And under normal circumstances, that's what would happen. So for instance, if for some reason the nuclear power plant needs to be shut down for repairs or whatever the case may be, the windmills and the oil and gas systems would ramp up and provide the extra energy consumption. And in normal times, for one system or the other going down, they'll be able to do that to a certain degree. Okay. However, when you're having a once-in-a-lifetime weather event, you are now in territory that is not normal. And that is what happened here. The windmills failed and lost 50% of their capacity. So instead of, they went from 25, generating 25, down to 12%. Okay. So that meant everything else had to ramp up. But what also happened is the nuclear power plant had a sensor fail. Let me bring up this story here. I'm just going to bring this up. So, according to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the shutdown of the nuclear reactor was caused by a disruption in the feed water plant to the reactor. And that caused the plant to automatically shut down on Monday. Now, there wasn't any danger to the reactor itself, but the way that they have these systems in for safety measures is that if anything shuts down, then at that point, you're going to shut down the whole system for safety's sake until they figure out what's going on. Okay? So that's what happened with the reactor. So once that happened, now everything was reliant on only about 12% capacity from whatever remaining windmills were still working and your oil. Now, remember I talked about legacy. So because of federal regulations of various types, there have not been a lot of additional natural gas infrastructure added on in Texas in order to have more power generation come from that area of the system. A lot of natural gas was really being used in other ways. Now, once this happened, Governor Abbott of Texas, by executive order, switched the natural gas from doing what it was doing, which is mostly like cooking, to providing electricity as well. But under ordinary circumstances, they would have had newer infrastructure added on over the last few years that would have provided more of the electrical power, so regular heat, lights, utilities and things of that nature for the grid generated from natural gas. But they didn't add on that infrastructure because they were building, you guessed it, the windmills. Instead of adding infrastructure for natural gas, they took the subsidies, or certain areas took the subsidies, and built the windmills instead. Okay? So, because of that, there's a lot more demand put on the oil and gas infrastructure, which itself is legacy, meaning there weren't additional infrastructure built into the system for oil and gas use. For oil usage because windmills. And so when the system got overloaded, it can't handle it. The system started cascading and failing. Now, understand that the biggest problem for a lot of this isn't really the individual systems in of themselves. It's the weather event. Okay, the infrastructure, the pipeline, and all of that that's in Texas is not designed for these temperatures. I mean, look, they're not designed. Wrong one. Bringing up the wrong screenshot here because I don't have them named, but they're not built for this. They're not built for that. Okay, because it's Texas. Like, if I woke up tomorrow and some weird weather event caused snow to be 6 feet, or not 6 feet, but 6 inches worth of snow in Florida of all places, our infrastructure would be in trouble because it's not built to handle that. So as soon as you have systems anywhere dealing with an event that it's not designed to deal with, you start having system failures. Okay, so once that happens, you have a cascading effect. The windmills stop working. The nuclear plant shuts down because the sensor gets frozen. And now the oil system has to ramp up to a level and provide a much higher degree of energy for everybody because, of course, they're now heating their homes at a higher level than they would be ordinarily across the whole state. Those types of redundancies aren't in there. And so this is why we have it. And because it takes additional infrastructure in order to generate the extra power that you need, that's not something that these energy companies can just fix overnight. I mean, you literally have to begin repairing the systems, and the weather has to turn for the better in order for you to start getting things back online. That's the 100% truth about what's going on in Texas. See, what the ordinary person doesn't realize, because you're too busy dealing with your job, your bills, your kids, running to this event or that event, or since we're stuck in the houses in many states, trying to find ways to entertain your kids for many more hours than you ordinarily would be. If you don't have kids, then maybe it's honeymoon time again for you and your wife. Who knows? The point is, you're not thinking about the nitty-gritty details of stuff like this. Very often when it comes to large-scale projects, infrastructure projects of any sort, very often a lot of the costs and a lot of the problems or delays or issues that come up when an emergency happened, you discover that it's been regulations or other forms of government intervention that has either caused the problem or caused a fertile ground for the problem to grow. So, it has been years. I mean, in fact, let me see if I can just look it up on my computer right now. Last time a new nuke plant was built. So, okay, not bad. There was one reactor to enter service in Tennessee back in 2016, so that's not bad. But before that, the last one was like 1996. And the reasons for that are obvious. The environmental agencies and the environmental groups in the country don't like nuclear power. They're scared of nuclear power, and they want you to be scared of nuclear power. And we could go into a whole, diatribe and separate video about why that's the case and why they're wrong about that. But the bottom line is, you're only going to get power from a few places: oil, gas, coal, some combination of wind or solar or nuclear. Those are your area 6. Now, green people want you to use solar. They want you to use windmills. They might want you to use some sort of hydroelectric or some sort of new system that uses algae or something like that. All of those are pretty much new industries or new takes on old infrastructure or new projects, things like windmills, but they're not reliable. And they're not reliable in this sense. One, they don't by themselves generate the amount of power that any city or any state needs to run all of their infrastructure. Okay? And obviously solar is not going to make your car, is not going to power your car. Okay? Now, so that's not going to get it. The other thing is solar panels and windmills specifically, and we see this with the situation in Texas, is as a form of generating power, they're the least reliable in the sense that they can break down faster than the other ways of getting electricity. Okay? If you, for instance, once they are able to get certain systems in place, it's easier to ramp up on the coal side, nuclear side, or oil and gas side than it is with windmills, because you'd have to put up a hell of a lot more windmills in order to generate the amount of power you need to run, say, Houston, for example. The other thing is, and some people have talked about, well, look, we have windmills in Alaska. And that's right, we do have windmills in Alaska. We have windmills in Idaho as well. And it's necessary to use fossil fuels, oil, in order to maintain those windmills, because when it gets too cold and of course they begin to ice up, they need to use oil in order to warm them up to the point that they de-ice and to restart them. So any way you cut it, these green technologies are not mature enough to be used for the type of life that we live right now. So you either have to decide, do you want to live, if you want America to switch and live to the way it was, say, almost 100 years ago, or do you want everything to be the way it is now? If you want everything to be the way it is now, then these technologies aren't ready. Particularly when you start talking about wanting to increase electric car usage in the country, which is one of the goals of, say, California and one of the stated goals of the Biden administration. Now, I don't like electric cars. You find me a car that works as well as a gas-powered car that's electric, fine. That's a separate subject. The issue is electric cars are run by batteries, which means you have to charge the batteries. In order to charge the batteries, you have to have electricity. You can't generate the amount of electricity that you need for the degree to which they want the electric car revolution to occur with solar panels. You can't generate enough electrical power through windmills for what they want to do with electric cars. You can't generate enough electricity with hydroelectric for what they want to do with electric cars. If you take all three of those green technologies and put them together, you cannot generate the electricity needed to charge the batteries for the amount of electric cars that the Biden administration wants the country to move toward. You have to get the electricity someplace else. And if you don't want it to be oil and you don't want it to be coal, it has to be nuclear. If you're not willing to build new nuclear plants, then you don't get electric cars. It's that simple. So, what does Texas do moving forward? What do your other, if you're involved in local politics in your city and state, then this would be a situation for you to look into. What is your state and locality doing with regard to the grid? Because whatever natural disasters or natural weather events that happen in your area at some point an extreme one that you haven't seen in a long time is going to occur, and in some form or fashion, your grid, your infrastructure is going to be at risk. So if you're involved in local politics, these are the type of questions you should be asking. What are we investing? Why aren't we investing in more reliable sources? What Texas is going to have to do is say, fine, we want windmills, but also build more nuclear plants and more oil and natural gas infrastructure, so that as you're building the unreliable green ones, when it fails, as inevitably it will, you've got plenty of the most reliable form of power generation available to you. The other thing is, and look, this is a matter of your tax dollars and the way that your tax dollars are used, whether it's in Texas, California, Florida, or any other state. The way that politicians and officials in your legislature make decisions is based on what do they think is most likely to happen, right? Buildings in Florida are not built to building codes that are in California for earthquakes, because we don't get earthquakes. So if we have one all of a sudden, guess what happens to all those buildings? They're all going to come tumbling down. Okay. Now, does that mean that we should start ramping up our building code to protect against something like that? I don't know. I mean, that's the type of decisions that you have to make. So unfortunately, what the lesson that Texas has learned is, because of our population and because of the demands on the power grid, as the state gets more people moving into it, they're going to have to spend the money to ramp up their infrastructure to a level to handle events that they don't think is going to happen. And that is a very hard thing to do, because leaders in all areas of life, but particularly in government, do not think that way. They don't think about what's improbable. They think about what's most likely to happen. We saw this with the levees in New Orleans. They knew that they needed to rebuild those levees for like 20 plus odd years, but they didn't, because they didn't want to spend the money, and they didn't think an event like we saw in Hurricane Katrina was ever going to happen. It was improbable. Not impossible, but improbable. And then the improbable occurred, and they were screwed. That's what's happened down in Texas. The improbable has occurred, and now they're screwed. So that is going to do it for this. Oh, it looks like that's going to do it for this particular video. If you have any comments, particularly it looks like one of my screens up here did a picture-in-picture, so you saw two of me talking and I didn't realize it. I'll correct that for the next video. But if you want to make fun of me, feel free to put it down in the comments. Hit the subscribe button and hit the notification bell so you know that when I put out a new video, hopefully one that doesn't have a mistake at the end like there.